Good day everyone, I'm Daegee Alcazar from VW1 and I am here to start with and talk about Chapter 12, Decision Making. Start with, being independent is not always, sometimes we need others to find more about who we really are and what we really want. Thus, people turn to groups when they must solve problems and make decisions, to be better informed, review, and appraise ideas. In this chapter, we will learn by answering these questions. First, how do groups make decisions? What problems undermine the effectiveness of decision-making in groups? Why do groups make riskier decisions than individuals? What is groupthink and how can it be prevented? First, what do you think are the pros and cons of making decisions in groups? Group decisions can either be good and bad. We have groups of people building our houses, inventing things we're enjoying right now, and of course, making and helping our group presentations. However, there are also groups of people killing and taking innocent lives. So to do good or not, success or failure, the decision is made within the group. And now let's hop on to the process of making decisions. In making group decisions, we have 4 phases and we call it ODD process model or ODDI process model. It is a conceptual analysis of the steps or processes that groups generally follow when making a decision, based on the intended purpose of each step or process in the overall decision-making sequence. Moreover, OD or ODDI stands for Orientation, Discussion, Decision, and Implementation. And now, here we have the decision-making processes, starting from orientation to discussion to decision and implementation. In orientation, the group defines the problem, sets goals, and develops a strategy in the orientation phase. Next, during the discussion phase, the group gathers information about the situation, and if a decision must be made, it next identifies and considers options. And during the decision phase, the group chooses its solution by reaching consensus, voting, or using some other social decision process. Lastly, in the implementation phase, the groups put the decision into action and assess the consequences of their choice. However, these 4 processes or stages need not to occur in order, but groups that follow these 4 stages are more likely to make better decisions. And now let's understand more the orientation process. During the orientation process, our decisions begin with a problem that needs a solution. For example, as a group of students in Psych 113 class, we are required to make a presentation for this chapter and present it to the class. So certain situations like this trigger a decision-making process that often begins with a period of orientation. So under this phase, we have goal clarity and goal path clarity that are basically needed during this phase. In goal clarity or goal clarification, it requires not only setting specific attainable goals but also the review of the group's overall mission, the problems it is dealing with and the decisions it must make, the results it intends to deliver, and the criteria it will use to evaluate the quality of its performance and results. So this is because some groups may know exactly what they want to achieve and how they will go about doing it. But most groups must first clarify both the goals they seek and the path they will take to reach those goals. So next we have goal path clarity or goal path clarification, which is in contrast requires spelling out just how the group will do its work, including identifying tasks and subtasks, organizing members' roles and responsibilities, specifying how the members will work together, determining how the group will make its decisions, and setting milestones and deadlines. So this is both groups and the individuals or members of those groups are more successful, like they could make better decisions, solve problems more efficiently, and of course waste less time. Further, given the clear benefits of spending time setting goals and making plans, it is unfortunate that only a few groups show much interest in planning their procedures. Thus, problems with planning occur. So under this, we have planning fallacy, which is the tendency to underestimate just how long a task will take to finish. This fallacy occurs because most people assume that the future will be pleasant rather than bleak. So we have here a famous example, which is the construction of the famous landmark of Sydney, the Opera House. So it was stated there that it took 10 years longer and nearly $100 million or more to complete the construction than was originally planned. So one major reason was the government's insistence on starting the construction early, despite the fact that the plans for the construction was not yet, or the construction plans were not yet finished. So that's it. And now let's pause for a moment and think about this question. Are group discussions a waste of time? Let's find out through learning the Parkinson's Law. The University North Code Parkinson's time management laws are particularly apt when applied to groups. So Parkinson's first law, which he modestly named Parkinson's Law, states that a task will expand to fill the time available for its completion. Like in other words, the more time you have, the longer you will take to complete a task. For example, as a student, which happens all the time in and outside the school, there's plenty of time to complete a certain task. We sometimes try postpone doing it, and when we are finally running out of time to get started, we immediately spring into action with full gear, and then here we welcome our narrative like we can now work under pressure, which is in reality could be sometimes true and sometimes not. So next we have the Parkinson's second law, which is the law of triviality. States that the time the group spends on discussing any issue will be in inverse proportion to the consequentiality of the issue. It is simply meant that we spend much more time on less important things during the discussion, which somehow we can relate to it undeniably. For example, within a group, the members are spending an hour discussing what would be the best design to use for the group presentation, rather than discussing about the tasks or topics that should be assigned to the members. And now let's go back to the question, are group discussions a waste of time? Is it a yes, a no, or maybe? Definitely a no, if the group is aiming for and has a goal. But definitely it is a yes if the discussion is pointless and insignificant.
Good day everyone, I am Jerah Lou, and I am going to report the following. In decision making, information is the lifeblood. We tend to generate decision basically from the given information. And in most common cases, we examined all kinds of issues through discussion. That's why, in arriving to a certain decision, the process of discussion is essential. Discussion is a communication of information between two or more people undertaken for some shared purpose, such as solving a problem, making a decision, or increasing participants' mutual understanding of the situation. Through discussion, we communicate with people, and of course, there is a shared purpose, such as understanding and solving the problem. Upon doing discussion, here comes the collective information processing model. It is when people seek out and process relevant information, but that they do this cognitive work during the group discussion. This is effective since people discuss the problem as a group, they improve their memory for information. Also, they enhance their way of exchanging information with each other. And also, they improve the process of information, like it will flow more thoroughly and will be able to identify errors and mistakes. Discussion promotes collective memory process, which is a process of two or more heads sharing and collecting essential information through discussion. This is great in a way that group members remember more than individuals because groups draw more memories that contains different types of information. Thus, collective memory will be generated. Collective memory is a group's combined memories, including each member's memories, the group's shared mental models, and transactive memory systems, which means it is the shared reservoir of information held in the memories of two or more members of a group, and that makes the discussion effective in decision making. This is to emphasize the relevance of group memories that in doing group discussion, it is making use the transactive memory system. Transactive memory system is a mechanism through which groups collectively encode, store, and retrieve knowledge. That makes a group in a discussion called network of networks, means there's a lot to learn and grasp from the different people's ideas, which will be truly helpful in generating decisions. So, how can the group also improve their access to information stored in members' memories? Doing cross-cowing. Cross-cowing is the enhancement of recall that occurs during group discussion when the statements made by group members serve as cues for the retrieval of information from the memories of other group members. This process occurs when one member says something that jogs other members' memories, which contribute of retrieving memories. Second, it is the information exchange. Information exchange is the discussion that involves exchanging ideas and knowledge, because exchanging information among the members of the group further strengthen their access to every individual's information, and so it helps the group to improve their access to information stored in members' memories. Next thing, to how group can improve their access to information stored in member memories is the processing of information. Processing information involves taking raw information and making it useful by putting it into context. So, to make it happen, members ask questions and others offer answers. Also, there's a discussion of alternative options and discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the considered options. Furthermore, group members will analyze each other's ideas and offer necessary correction when they note errors. Moreover, members of decision-making groups not only share and evaluate information, but they also encourage each other to express commitment to the group and help each other. Next is having the advantage of error detection and correction. Error detection and correction As groups discuss information, they appraise the validity of ideas being shared. Also, it is seeking increased accuracy, and members will identify any errors of fact or implications. And it is a crucial determinant of successful decision. Nevertheless, the limitations are apparent to anyone who attends meeting with any frequency, and according to the following factors, it affects or discuss why discussion tend to be difficult. First is the factor poor meeting planning. The meeting was poorly organized. For example, it included the wrong people, the time needed for the work was inadequate, and the agenda used to structure the meeting was unhelpful or inaccurate. Second factor, it is the lack of skill in communication. Not only did members frequently fail to listen to what others had to say, but they rarely communicated their ideas and opinions in engaging and informative ways. Next is the factor of egocentric behavior. This is when some members dominated the meeting or used the meeting to flaunt idiosyncrasies, intimidate others, grandstand, and most of the time complain. Next factor that contributes why discussion tend to be difficult is low of engagement. It is when too many members did not take part in an active way in the sessions. They did not speak, volunteer to join with others working on projects, and sometimes just stared silently at others. Next factor is sidetracked. The meeting did not stay on the topic with many tangents and irrelevancies. Also, that is the reason of calling meetings as waste of time. Next factor is interruptions. It is that the meeting's flow was disrupted as members interrupted each other. Example, took phone calls or engaged in side conversations. Next factor is inadequate leadership. The leader was not organized and so did not facilitate or control the meeting's process. Next, negative attitudes and emotions. Perhaps members did not communicate in a civil, respectful way. However, they expressed anger, grumbled, and so on. Last thing, of the following factors that making the discussion tend to be difficult is the follow-up, meaning nothing ever happened as a result of the meeting, no implementation of decisions. And that is all my report. Thank you.
To continue, I'm going to discuss about making the decision and implementation. First, making the decision. A social decision scheme is a group's method for combining individual members' inputs in a single group decision. Some groups have already defined ways of making a decision. Their bylaws may state, for example, that they follow a particular rule of order, such as Robert's Rule. In many cases, though, the social decision scheme is an implicit one that is taken for granted by groups. Not until someone says, "Let's take a vote," does the group realize that a decision must be made. But how to make a decisions? Some common social decision schemes are averaging, voting, reaching consensus, or delegating. Each decision scheme has strengths as well as weaknesses. Let's define it one by one. Averaging is statisticized decision. In some cases, Groups make decisions by combining each individual's preferences using some type of computational procedure. If the group must select the best option among 5 alternatives, for example, each member could make his or her decision individually, either before or after a group discussion, and these private recommendations could then be averaged to yield a group decision. As with compensatory tasks discussed in Chapter 10, such decisions do not necessarily require any interaction among members, and they are often surprisingly accurate. They weigh equally all the group members' opinions, and errors tend to cancel each other out. Unfortunately, there are equally important disadvantages associated with the timing of the ranking processes. If the group just average without discussion, then the benefits of discussion will be lost. If, however, the group averages after a discussion, biases and inaccuracies introduced during the discussion may skew the group's conclusions. Members may also feel that the process is too arbitrary and so feel little responsibility for implementing this decision. Voting plurality decisions. Most groups, at least in Western cultures, use some type of voting procedure to make decisions. Members express their individual preferences publicly or to reduce social pressure by secret ballot. In most cases, this group selects the alternative favored by the majority of the members, the very common majority rule scheme. But in some cases, a more substantial plurality, such as the 2/3 majority scheme, is needed before a decision becomes final. Some groups also use ranking methods with more points awarded to alternatives that are ranked higher than others, the border count method. In even rarer cases, the group's decision rules may give single individuals the authority to rule against any impending decision, the veto scheme. When researchers compared these decision rules, plurality was both easy and effective. Even groups that do not vote officially implicitly adopt a plurality decision. People assume that if more group members think option A is better than option B, the group will be picking option A, even if it is the wrong one. But plurality, despite its overall effectiveness, has limitations. When the vote is close, some members of the group may feel alienated and defeated. In consequence, they become dissatisfied with their membership and are less likely to lend support to the decision. Voting can also lead to internal politics as members get together before meetings to apply pressure, form coalitions, and trade favors to ensure the passage of proposals that they favor. Also, if the vote is taken publicly, individuals may A. conform to others' opinion rather than expressing their personal views, or refuse to change their public opinion so as to maintain the image of independence and consistency. Reaching consensus, unanimous decisions. The Bay of Pigs Advisory Committee took several polls of the members, but in the final review, the group's position was unanimous. All agreed that the covert invasion of Cuba should proceed as planned. Some groups, such as juries, officially adopt a consensus rule, but in many cases, groups that adopt a plurality decision scheme reach consensus at the final vote. The outcome can occur when all the group actually agree, but it is also happens when the minority who disagree vote for the favored solution for various reasons, including not wanting to be on the side of that losses. Consensus decision schemes are often galvanizing and can lead to high levels of commitment to the decision and to the group. People usually express more satisfaction with this procedure than any other decision-making method. However, consensus building takes a good deal of time, and if rushed, the strategy can misfire. Consensus, no matter if achieved by voting or through prolonged discussion ending in unanimity, has long-term positive effects on performance. Delegating, sharing decisions. The group as a whole does not make the decision when the decision is made by the group's leader or is delegated to one of the members, a subgroup within the group, or someone outside of the group. Under an authority scheme, the leader, president, or other individual makes the final decision with or without input from the group members. When an oligarchy operates in a group, a coalition speaks for the entire group. Other forms of delegation include asking an expert to answer, the best informed member, or forming a subcommittee made up of a few members to study the issue and reach a conclusion. Moving on, social justice. Implementation is in some cases more or less successful depending on perceptions of the fairness of the decision. Fairness judgments are determined by two forms of social justice, the distributive and procedural. In distributive justice, it is concerns on how rights, resources, and costs are granted to, shared with, and imposed on, distributed across a group's members. And another definition of distributed justice is it perceives fairness of the distribution of rights, resources, and costs. Procedural justice, in contrast, is concerned with the methods used to make decisions about the allocation of resources. Procedural justice asks, did we make the decision in a fair way? And it defines in another way as it perceives fairness and legitimacy of the methods used to make decisions, resolve disputes, and allocate resources. Also, in judicial contexts, the use of fair and impartial procedures. When fair procedures are followed, the group members feel more satisfied with the decision and will be more likely to perform the tasks that are required to implement the decision. For example, many of the members of the President's advisory group were against the Bay of Pigs plan, but they believed that the group had examined the issue in a fair, impartial way, and so on. When the decision was made, they supported the group's choice. Industrial organizational psychologist Victor Vroom, recognizing the pros and cons of using groups to make decisions, developed the normative model of decision-making to determine when the group's input on an issue is needed. It is defined as a theory of decision-making and leadership that predicts the effectiveness of group-centered, consultative, and autocratic decisional procedures across a number of group settings. Although decisional methods can fall anywhere along the continuum from leader-centered to group-centered, Vroom's most recent model identifies these 5 basic methods. First, leader decides. The leader solves the problem or makes the decision and announces it to the group. Second, leader consults members. The leader shares the problem within the group members individually, getting their ideas and suggestions one-on-one without meeting as a full group. Next, leader consults the group. The leader discusses the problem with the members as a group, collectively obtaining their input. And next, facilitated group discussion. The leader coordinates the group's analysis of the problem, helping the group reach consensus on the issue. And lastly, group decides. If the group already functions independently of the leader, then the group can make its decision without the leader's direct involvement. Participation and voice. Many factors influence perceptions of procedural fairness, but when people believed that they had a voice in the matter, that they could have expressed any concerns they had, and others would have listened and responded, then they tend to be far more engaged in the implementation of the final decision. That only because it was based on incorrect information about the region and the forces that were involved in the conflict, but also because the planners did not agree on the basic purpose of the mission. As the attack unfolded, changes were made to deal with circumstances, and these choices did not have the desired effects. The mission failed. Kennedy and his staff did not execute the planning, discussion, and decision stages skillfully, but they did do well during the implementation stage. Dysfunctional post-decision tendency. Groups should expend considerably time and energy reviewing their efforts and outcomes. They should gather and weigh information about their performance and review the strategies they use to make their decision and implement their solution. But groups are often so confident that their solution is the correct one that the post-decision review process is unsystematic, untunated, biased, or skip altogether. Groups also prefer to deny responsibility should their decision result in failure. The officer at the Enron Corporation, for example, when explaining their company's abuses, blamed their accountants for using the wrong auditing methods. When the Challenger space shuttle exploded, NASA scientists blamed the engineers who designed the O-rings, but the engineers blamed NASA for launching the shuttle in cold weather. In the aftermath of the failed invasion of Cuba, President Kennedy publicly took the blame for the failure, but he also ended the careers of several group members who he believed were actually at fault.
Good day, everyone. I am Raymond AMOSON, and as a continuation of our report, in making an activity, there is this kind of person who prefer to work alone because he or she thinks that he or she can perform well in working alone. But in terms of group project or activity, everyone should work as one to perform well or to make a better idea. And my topic for today is the decisional biases and the judgmental biases, in which these are the type of error that you see in a group. Decisional biases. Decisional biases explain that psychological bias, also known as cognitive bias, is a tendency to make decisions or take action in an illogical way. For example, you might subconsciously make selective use of data, or you might feel pressured to make a decision by powerful beliefs. It always depends on a situation. And then, making a decision in a group offers a number of advantages over making a decision alone. Groups with their greater informational resources and capacity to process that information are better able to identify solutions and to detect errors in reasoning. Members may also find a group's decision more satisfying than that of a single individual, particularly if the group uses consensus building decision processes. But even though groups have the potential to outperform individuals, they do not always reach that potential. Groups do not always correct for the biases that plug individuals' decision makers In fact, in some cases, they amplify them. And after collecting all the ideas, all the mm, all the suggested ideas that you gather from your member, here come arises the judgmental biases. A final bias is a tendency to favor one's own interests and self, even when consciously trying to be fair and objective. Egocentric bias regularly leads people to overestimate their own positive contribution and responsibility. These biases have implication for conflict management. And then psychologists have identified a number of cognitive and motivational biases that systematically distort our judgment and our decision. For example, we often use the information we have available to us inappropriately, putting too much emphasis on interesting information and ignoring statistical information. We sometimes form conclusions very quickly and then do not sufficiently revise those conclusions once we acquire additional information. When we cannot easily imagine an outcome, we assume that such an outcome is less likely to occur than one that's surprisingly easily to mind. We overestimate our judgment accuracy because we remember all the times that our decisions were confirmed and forget the times when our prediction were disconfirmed. And then we have this decisional scene group. We have first the scenes of commission, the misusing information in some way, continuing to base judgment on false, irrelevant information. And the examples are the belief of perseverance, and then reliance on information that has already been reviewed and found to be inaccurate. Sunk cost bias, reluctance to abandon a course of action once an investment has been made in an action. And then extra evidentiary bias, the use of information that one has been told explicitly to ignore. And then the hindsight bias, the tendency to overestimate the accuracy of one's prior knowledge of an outcome. The next is the sin of omission, failing to seek out information, overlooking useful information, or not checking for errors and mistakes. For example, base rates bias, failure to pay attention to information about general tendencies, fundamental attribution errors, stressing these positional causes when making attributions about cause of people's behavior, confirmation bias, failure to seek out information that may disconfirm a conclusion. And the third one is the sin of imprecision, relying inappropriately on mental rules of thumb or heuristics that oversimplify the decision or introduce errors in the decision process. Examples: the availability of heuristics, basing decision on information that is readily available. Conjunction bias, failing to recognize that the probability of two events occurring together will always be less than the probability of just one of the events occurring. Last is the representativeness heuristic, excessive reliance on the salient but misleading aspect of a problem. And these three already discussed on our previous course, which is the social psychologist, and I will no longer emphasize these examples because I hope we all remember it. And then though those conflict or error that I've already mentioned a while ago already exist in a group, and still we can minimize it and avoid restoring our rationality. Each individual in a group can take steps to minimize their susceptibility to these biases. Discussion gives group members opportunity to test their initial inclination and to avoid the confirmation bias by creating these three kind of group that research studies each member in a group can work well. First is unanimous groups composed of individuals who share the same initial preference. Second is groups with one member who took a minority position on the issue. And last is the group with two minority members. Participants in these three conditions were given the opportunity to select and review background readings which either supported or opposed their initial preferences. A fourth set of participants made these choices as individuals. Everyone, both groups and individuals, sought out data that confirmed their initial preferences, a very robust confirmation bias. But the diverse group were less biased than the groups composed of individuals who all agreed with each other. Groups with two dissenting members, in fact, even bested individuals decision makers, reversing the tendency for groups to be less rational than individuals. Groups can also maximize the rationality of their members in one simple way. Pay them when they make good decisions. Just like the experimental economist that finds that their groups are more rational than individual, particularly when incentivized or given a reward, usually monetary, for making a good decision. That's all. Thank you.
Hi Psychmates! Today I'm going to discuss about the shared information bias. So shared information bias or common knowledge effect, the tendency for groups to spend more time discussing information that only members know, shared information, and less time examining information that only a few members know or unshared. The shared information bias may also develop during group discussion in response to the interpersonal and psychological needs of individual group members. For example, some group members tend to seek group support for their own personal opinions. So next is the common knowledge effect. The good news is that group can pool their individual resources to make a decision that takes into account far more information that any one individual can consider. The bad news is that groups often exhibit the shared information bias. They spend too much of their discussion time examining details that two or more group members know in common rather than information known by only one of them. So the common knowledge effect describes the impact on group decision making on whether knowledge relevant to a decision is shared by all group members prior to discussion. If a piece of unshared information is crucial to make a correct decision, then the result may be an incorrect decision. So, next is what causes the shared information bias? The shared information bias reflects the dual purposes of discussion as a form of informational influence. Discussions help individuals marshal the evidence and information they need to make a good decisions. But as a form of normative influence, discussions give members the chance to influence each other's opinions on the issue. Discussing unshared information may be enlightening, but discussing shared information helps the group reach consensus. Hence, the bias is strongest when group members are seeking closure.
They want to convince the group to back their initial preferences, or the problems are complex and have no clear right or wrong answer. The bias is attenuated if groups are working under the time pressure and have relatively few alternatives to consider. So, the shared information bias also reflects the psychological and interpersonal needs of the group members. So, if the group members enter into a group discussion with a clear preference, they will argue in favor of their presence and resist changing their minds. So next is, can shared information bias be avoided? Let's see. Even though groups prefer to spend time discussing shared information, experienced members avoid this tendency, and they often intervene to focus the group's attention on a shared data. Moreover, as the discussion progressed, they were more likely to repeat unshared information that was mentioned during the session, evidence of their attempt to bring unshared information out through the discussion. So groups can also avoid the shared information bias if they spend more time actively discussing the decisions. So let's proceed to group polarization. Interesting topic. So group polarization is defined as a phenomenon when members of a deliberating group move toward a more extreme point in whatever direction is indicated by the members' pre-deliberation tendency. Group polarization leads to changing attitude among individuals within the group. Polarization in groups researchers eventually realized that risky shifts after group discussion. We are a part of more general processes. When people discuss issues in group, they sometimes draw a more extreme conclusion than would be suggested by the average of the individual judgments. The direction of this shift depends on the average initial preferences. When supporters gather to discuss a candidate's strengths and weaknesses, by the meetings and their opinions will likely become even more favorable toward the candidate. Causes of polarization. How do groups intensify individuals' reactions? Early explanations suggested that groups feel less responsible for their decisions and are overly influenced by risk-prone leaders. But in time, investigators recognized that polarization results from social influence processes that operate routinely in groups, including social comparison, persuasion, and social identity processes by Friedkin, 1999. So, first is social comparison. When we make choices together, we use others as reference points to evaluate our own preferences and positions. Example, we discover the majority of the group likes risk. Then to make a good impression, we might claim that we really like taking risk. So that is social comparison. So let's proceed to persuasive arguments. We change our opinions because we are persuaded by others' arguments and ideas. And groups usually generate more arguments that support the position endorsed by the majority of the group, or the position that is most consistent with dominant social values. As a result, the group persuades itself as more arguments favoring the dominant viewpoint are brought up during the discussion. So last is social identity. Curiously, at least for the persuasive arguments theory, we sometimes shift our opinions when we discover others' positions but not their arguments. Why? Because social identity theory suggests that we are not persuaded by the content of others' arguments, but by consensus of opinion. If through discussion, we come to believe that the prototypical group member holds a relatively extreme attitude on the issue, if we identify the group, we will shift in that direction. So lastly is the consequences of polarization. So what is the consequence of polarization? Polarization may, in some cases, yield positive effects. Groups, when when viewed from an evolutionary perspective, were designed to monitor risk. Hence, they are sensitively to threats and urge caution when alarmed. A group's collective efficacy may rise. Individual optimistic members join together and discuss their chances for success. The members of a support group may become far more hopeful for their chances for recovery when they gather together with others who are moderately optimistic. Innovations and new ideas may be adopted by large numbers of people as polarization implies enthusiasm for the new products, methods, or outlooks. Polarization may also encourage the strengthening or positions with the group that might go unexpressed or even be surprised. So thus, polarization through sometimes a source or error and bias can in some cases have a beneficial impact on the group and its numbers. So that's all. Thank you.
Victims of Groupthink. According to a social psychologist, Irving Janis, groupthink is a mode of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, and when the members' strivings for unanimity override their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of actions. This is why Irving Janis got intrigued and did a research by searching groups that had errors in judgment and decision making, because he wondered if something more than such common group difficulties as faulty communication and judgmental biases were to blame. And from the insights that he had gathered about the groups that he said to had failed to make the best decision it could, he came into the conclusion that they have experienced groupthink. And during groupthink, members try so hard to agree with one another that they make mistakes and commit errors. And to better understand this, here is Irving Janis' theory of groupthink. He had identified these three key sets of antecedent conditions that set the stage for groupthink, including cohesion, structural faults of the group or organization, and provocative situational context. These conditions cause members to seek out agreement with others, and that is a concurrence-seeking tendency, which in turn leads to two classes of observable consequences, which is the symptoms of groupthink and symptoms of defective decision making. Let us first get to know the symptoms of groupthink. Just like how illnesses have symptoms for doctors to be aware, there are also symptoms of groupthink. And Irving Janis organized these symptoms into three categories: overestimation of the group, closed-mindedness, and pressures toward uniformity. Let us first get familiar with overestimation. Overestimation of the group. In this symptom of groupthink, members of the group usually assume that everything is working perfectly and even expresses enthusiasm in their public statements about their wrong-headed decisions. And these symptoms, the decision tends to be full of wrong choices, and Irving Janis recognizes this unwarranted optimism as illusions of invulnerability and illusions of morality. What are those two? Illusions of invulnerability. This is when members of the group share an illusion of invulnerability that creates excessive optimism and encourages taking abnormal risks. So what's with this illusion of invulnerability? This illusion of invulnerability affects the decision making of the group. It's because this is where they think that they are performing well, even though they are actually not. Although this is helpful, being confident and being optimistic, but thinking that all obstacles can be easily overcome through power and good luck can really cut short, clear analytic thinking in decision-making groups. That's why it affects the decision-making of the group. The second one is illusions of morality. This is where victims ignore the the ethical or moral consequences of their decisions and believe unquestionably in the morality of their group. Groups are actually capable of reaching high levels of moral thought, but this capability is not realized during groupthink because groups sticks to believe in the inherent morality of their group and whatever their decisions are. The next symptom is closed-mindedness. Groups that are overtaken by groupthink are not open-minded groups. They search for new ideas and perspectives, but they don't have an open mind. So a group with this symptom becomes a close-minded group that rigidly shut off from alternatives, merely seeking to bolster their initial decision through rationalization and stereotypes. What are these two? Collective rationalization is where victims of this behavior ignore and discount warnings and negative feedback that may cause the group to reconsider their previous assumptions. In collective rationalization, a group just dismisses objectives out of hand through shared, which is not really unwarranted, justifications. The second one is stereotyping. This is when members of the group possess negative and or stereotypical views of their enemies. This is what really affects a group's decision because the group's underestimation to their enemies causes the failure of a group to function. Third symptoms of groupthink is pressures toward uniformity. In groupthink situations, interpersonal pressures make agreeing too easy and disagreeing too difficult. And according to Janice, there are 4 indicators of this pressure. The first one is when victims avoid self-censorship, wherein victims avoid deviating from what the group consensus is and keep quiet. Their doubts and concerns about the group are not expressed, and victims of groupthink may undermine the importance of validity of their doubts. So in this indicator of this symptom pressures toward uniformity, although there are some members of the group privately feel uncertain about a group's plan or decision, they just still keep their doubts to themselves because in this self-censorship they don't express themselves and they just keep quiet. Then the next indicator is illusion of unanimity. This is when victims of groupthink share an illusion of unanimity and that the majority view and judgment of the group are unanimous. This is where in the decision making of a group, some may appear to be agreeing, but they actually disliked what was being decided. That is illusion of unanimity. And they just agree because that is what the majority chooses. The next indicator of this symptom is direct social pressure. This is when victims apply direct pressure to any individual who momentarily expresses concern or doubt about the group's shared views. And members are not able to express their own individual arguments against the group. And the last indicator is mind guards. This is when victims of groupthink may appoint themselves to protect the group and the group leader from information that may be problematic or contradictory to the group's views, decisions, or cohesiveness. In this so-called mind guard, an indicator of this symptom, it diverts controversial information away from the group by losing it or forgetting to mention it or deeming it irrelevant and thus unworthy of the group's attention. And also, the mind guard would take dissenting members aside and pressure them to keep silent so that they will not speak up and let their views or to express their views or perspective. That is all the symptoms, and now we're down to the defective decision making. Part of this defective decision making are these symptoms: omissions in survey of objectives and alternatives, poor information search, and other errors in processing information and decision making. Decision making of a group is defective if the group will only discuss about risky alternative while ignoring all other potential alternatives and disregards other important information that could make a group more successful and that can make a group avoid failure. However, Irving Janis stated that he is not only considering a group overtaken by groupthink only because it made a bad decision, but because it displayed symptoms of groupthink and symptoms of defective decision making. That is when a group is considered as having or experiencing groupthink. And all the other information about Janis's theory about groupthink will be discussed by the next reporter.
Good day everyone. So I am going to discuss the 12 3C, Causes of Groupthink, and the Emergence of Groupthink, the 12 3D. So, Causes of Groupthink. Groupthink occurs when a very important decision is made in a stressful situation and when the stakes are potentially very high. But to Janis, groupthink is like a disease that infects healthy groups, rendering them inefficient and unproductive. The symptom of this disease signals the groups declined, but they are not the root causes of groupthink. These processes contribute to poor judgment, but Janis in 1987 distinguished between symptoms of groupthink and its causes: the cohesiveness, structural faults of the group or organization, and provocative situational factors. First, the cohesiveness. Of the many factors that contribute to the rise of groupthink, Janis emphasized the cohesiveness above all others. He agreed that lack of cohesion can also make terrible decisions, especially if the members are engaging in internal warfare, but they cannot experience groupthink. But in a cohesive group, members refrain from speaking out against decision, avoid arguing with others, and strive to maintain friendly, cordial relationship at all costs. In structural faults of the group organization, cohesion is necessary for groupthink, but the syndrome is more likely to emerge when the group is organized in ways that inhibit the flows of information and promote carelessness in the application of decision-making procedures. For example, in isolation. Isolation of the group from other groups can promote the development of unique, potentially inaccurate perspective on issues and their solution. And the next one is it depends on leadership style in the group. And the third one is the provocative situational context. So a number of provocative situational factors may push the groups in the direction of error rather than accuracy. As humans tend to be reluctant decision makers in the best of circumstances, they unravel when they must make important, high-stakes decisions, such as decisions trigger greater tensions and anxiety. So group members cope with this provocative decision stress in less than logical ways. Through collective discussion, the group members may rationalize their choices by exaggerating the positive consequences, minimizing the possibility of negative outcomes, and concentrating on minor details, also overlooking larger issues. Janis also suggested that any factors that work to lower members' self-esteem, such as history of mistakes or prior lapses of morality, may further increase the possibility of groupthink. 12.3d, the emergence of groupthink. Researchers attempted to replicate Janice's findings through archival case studies of other historical and political groups. They also examined specific aspects of the theory, such as the cohesion and stress on decision-making groups to determine if its key assumptions hold under empirical scrutiny. In archival studies, Janice compared groups that made very poor decisions to groups that made excellent choices to determine if error-prone groups exhibit more of the symptoms of groupthink. So, the result, as predicted, the higher the number of groupthink symptoms, the more unfavorable the outcomes of the group deliberations. And also, other archival studies indicated that the structure faults identified by Janice were related to groupthink, but cohesiveness and provocative situational context factor were not. When political scientists coded governmental groups that made both good decisions and bad decisions, they found considerable correspondence between variables Janice identified and symptoms displayed by poor performing groups. Again, these studies, which are reviewed briefly here, are sometimes support, sometimes challenge, and sometimes clarify Janice's theory. In cohesion and groupthink, Janice maintained that groupthink was a characteristic of cohesive group only. His basic prediction was that cohesion combined with one or more the other potential causes of groupthink, example the structural faults and provocative situational context, would trigger groupthink. A meta-analytic review of the results of 7 studies involving more than 1,300 participants provided that support of these predictions. The high cohesiveness impaired decision-making provide that one or more of the other triggering conditions for groupthink were present in the situation. If the other causes of groupthink were absent, the cohesiveness indicate the quality of group's decision-making processes. In the structural faults and groupthink, Janice identified several structural features of groups that can be contribute to groupthink, but researchers have concentrated most of their attention on the group leader. In one project, the researcher told some of the group assigned leaders to adopt a closed style and open style of the leadership. In closed style leadership, they were to announce their opinions on the cases prior to the discussion, while the open style leaders were told to withhold their own opinions until later in the discussion. So a closed style were more biased in their judgments, particularly when many of the group members had a high need for certainty. Other evidences, however, suggest that the leaders who are highly directive improve their group's decisions, provided that they limit their control to group's decision processes rather than the group's decisional outcomes. The provocative situational context. Studies of groups under stress suggest that they are more likely to make errors, lose their focus on their primary goals, and make use of procedures that members know have not been effective in the past. Social psychologist Janice Kelly and his colleagues, for example, have documented the negative impact of time pressures on both group performances and processes. They find that when groups work under time pressure, members focus much on their attention on the task, but doing so leaves them at risk of overlooking important contextual information. They also tend to concentrate on getting the task completed quickly and so become more concerned with efficiency and quick results rather than accuracy and quality. In consequence of this time pressure, the groups time pressure causes groups to produce a less creative and less adequate and less carefully reasoned decision. However, when a decision is routine or straightforward, these strategies can lead to adequate or even more decision making, even good decision making. And that ends my report. Thank you.
Alternative models in preventing groupthink. Researchers have proposed alternative models, including the Koglansky's group centrism theory. They have identified a syndrome which they termed as group centrism because it stems primarily from the desire of group members to preserve and support their group's unity. It is more likely a pattern that includes pressures to opinion uniformity, encouragement of autocratic leadership in group favoritism, rejection of deviates, resistance to change, and the perpetuation of group norms. Group-centric groups tend to rush to make judgments on the basis of insufficient information, particularly if they face situations that interfere with their capacity to process information, like time pressures, severe ambiguity, noise, or fatigue. They are more likely to reject a member who disagrees with the group, and they express a strong desire for agreement with other members. Then stereotype, thought, and tendencies to favor the in-group over the out-group increase, and willingness to compromise in order to reach integrative solutions during bargaining decreases. The group also strives for cognitive closure. It is the psychological desire to reach a final decision swiftly and completely. In other words, it is a psychological concept that defines a person's ability to get a clear answer to any question, leaving no room for uncertainty or misunderstanding. We have different level of need for cognitive closure. If you're at the top, predictability, order, and organizations are important to you. But if you're on the bottom, you'll feel more at ease. In open and vague circumstances, and indecision won't bother you as much. But most people, they are in the center of the scale, meaning they value order but can live with a certain amount of confusion or uncertainty. So groups whose members have a high need for cognitive closure are more likely to make poor decisions, or the greater the need for cognitive closure, the greater the stress. As an alternative to Janis' model, Robert Barron proposes a ubiquity model of groupthink. He suggests that these qualities are ubiquitous features of groups rather than rare ones. They only lead to problems when preconditions are met. First is the social identification. It is not group unity per se that increases groupthink symptoms, but rather a threat to a shared social identity that may result should the group fail. Second, the group must be one that has developed a set of norms that constrains members' opinions with regard to the topic under discussion, or group interaction and discussion must produce or reveal an emerging or dominant group norm. And third, groupthink is more likely if group members lack self-confidence. Low situational self-efficacy, in which group members generally lack self-confidence in their ability to reach satisfactory resolution of the conundrum facing them. In short, Barron's ubiquity model suggests that many groups display the negative decisional features identified by Janis, but these three factors will trigger groupthink-like decisions. Then, preventing groupthink. One of the examples of groupthink in action was the Bay of Pigs invasion, who had failed. Because President Kennedy made a decision and the people around him supported it despite their own concerns. So Irving Janis came up with groupthink because his findings came from research into why a team reaches an excellent decision one time and a disastrous one the next. What he found was that a lack of conflict or opposing viewpoints led to poor decisions because alternatives were not fully analyzed and because groups didn't gather enough information to make an informed decisions. So there are ways of how can group lessen their chances of succumbing through limiting premature seeking of concurrence, such as open style of leadership or devil's advocate in subgroup discussion. Just like the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy implemented changes, dropped his close leadership style, and reduced pressures to conform. He sometimes broke the advisors into separate groups. The second one is correcting misconceptions and biases. Members have to be willing to admit their personal inadequacies and ignorance. And lastly, using effective decision-making techniques. This increases its chances of success. It have to insist on exploring other alternatives, not just do this or don't do anything, or consult outside experts, or meticulously review steps when implanting. So that's it, guys.